service. I'd like to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17. Read, first of all, verses 3 through 11. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side. And there was a valley between them. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And one beareth a shield, went before him. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, Why are you come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? Choose you a man for you, let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me, and to kill me, then will we be your servants. If I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants, and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we might fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now notice verse 16. And the Philistine, Goliath of Gath, drew near morning and evening, and presented himself 40 days. Then notice verse 22 through 24. David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage, and ran into the army, and called and saluted his brethren. And as he talked with them, his brethren, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words as he had done for 40 days. And David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and were sore afraid. And then notice verse 45 through verse 50. Then said David to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword, with a spear, with a shield. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver me into mine hand, and I will smite thee and take thine head from thee. And I will give the carcass of the host of the Philistines this day to the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. And it came to pass, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag, and took thence, pages are sticking, a stone and sling, and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine, and slew him, but there was no sword in the hand of David. Very familiar account. It's the biblical record of a giant by the name of Goliath coming against Israel, and how a shepherd boy by the name of David slew, and conquered him. This is more than a children's Bible story. It is more than a children's chorus. What we read here is about how we serve a God who is greater than all, a God who can take care of situations that appear hopeless. So what we read here really is a picture of real life for God's people. So we must not view it as a mere children's story, but as instruction and encouragement for us. So what is contained here in this chapter are instructions that, if followed, will help us to live a victorious life. What is contained here is more than David defeating Goliath. There are lessons on how we are not merely to survive in life, but how we're to thrive in life. The lessons are many. We could preach for months, an entire series on this account. The giants that appear in our lives are many, and they are of great variety. And they can take on a variety of forms. And what is contained here is an example of how we overcome giants. And that's our subject, overcoming Goliaths. By looking at this incident, we learn some principles about facing the threatening and discouraging obstacles that come up in the life of all of God's people. So let's look at this event. The setting is pictured in verses 1 through 3. In verse 1, the armies of the Philistines are gathered together for a purpose, to battle. And in verse 2, there are the Israelites, and it says that they set the battle in array against the Philistines, which means that they are there with their forces in order. And then notice verse 3, the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side. And there was a valley between them. Now the place is Shoko. And on the one side, historians tell us, is a cliff going about a half a mile up. And on the other side is another cliff going about a half a mile up. You have the Israelites on one side, you have the Philistines on the other, and in between is a valley. And this valley is about a mile wide, and it's really more like a ravine. So there are these two armies, Israel on the one side, the Philistines on the other. And then coming to verse 4, we are introduced to Goliath of Gath. And we have a description of him. It says in verse 4 that he was a champion. It means he was a conqueror. That was his reputation. He was a conqueror. He was known to be a conqueror. And in verse 4, he steps forth. Why? To conquer. He steps forth and he does so to conquer. And we see him there. His height was 6 cubits and a span. That is, he is between 9.5 and 10 feet tall. We read in verse 5 that he has a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, that is a breastplate. And the weight of the coat or the breastplate was 5,000 shekels of silver, approximately 125 pounds. In addition to this, verse 6, he has greaves, that's armor, for his legs, of brass upon his legs, from his thigh to his heels. And he had a target of brass between his shoulders, that is a weight of brass upon his shoulders. In addition, verse 7, the staff, which would be the wooden part of his spear, was like a weaver's beam. Now, estimated in proportion to his height, it would have been about 16 feet long, this spear. This beam, the spear as well. And his spear's head weighed 600 shekels, about 30 pounds of iron. He also, in verse 45, had a sword. And in 1 Samuel 21, verse 9, David, speaking of the sword, said, "There's none like it. There's no sword like Goliath's." So there he stands, Goliath of Gath, with his armor weighing in excess of 200 pounds. He has a sword like no other. And we see him there, 9.5, 10-foot giant warrior, coming forth to conquer. He is a massive, enormous figure. This is no ordinary warrior. And we read in verse 7 that in addition to his menacing presence, there was one bearing a shield that went before him. So you have a brief description of Goliath. Now look at what Goliath did. Verse 8, and he, Goliath of Gath, stood, probably with his arms raised, 9.5, 10 feet tall, probably standing there with his arms raised. And he cried, no doubt with a booming voice, and you'd have the echo unto the armies of Israel. He's taunting them. He's challenging them. We're told in verse 16 that he did this twice a day. He did it in the morning, and he did it in the evening. And he had done so for 40 days. 80 times he had done this. Notice he presented, verse 16, himself 40 days. That is, he showed himself. He manifested himself so all could see. 80 times. Goliath of Gath, 9.5 to 10 feet tall, with armor weighing in excess of 200 pounds, would step forward. And he would set forth himself so all could see his size and strength, and he would taunt Israel. The effect of this, verse 11, the Israelites were dismayed. That is, they were horrified. They were unsettled. They were disturbed. They were alarmed. They were distressed. There are people that live their life in that condition. And notice it says, and greatly, that is immensely, afraid. Scared and terrified. In verse 24, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, when they saw Goliath, they fled from him and were sore, that is, painfully afraid. So they have a fear that causes them pain and agony. There's Israel. They had the promises of God. And there stands Goliath of Gath, 9.5 to 10 feet tall, with over 200 pounds of armor. And he stands between the past promises of God and the future fulfillment. He's in the way. He's a paralyzing force. Israel is facing a draining and exhausting situation. 80 times they've seen Goliath come forth with his booming voice, taunting. It was a perilous time for Israel. But this Goliath, he symbolizes the giants that we face in our lives. There are giants everywhere. You can take something that big and make it gigantic. People do it all the time. Take the littlest, tiniest thing and create a giant. Create a monstrous giant in their life. And they do this over and over and over again. They have hundreds of giants in their lives, and they're being controlled by them. Goliath comes in many shapes, in many forms. There are medical Goliaths. There are relational Goliaths. There are circumstantial Goliaths. There are career Goliaths. There are financial Goliaths. There are Goliaths of thought. Our mind goes and we create giants. There are imaginary giants. But they're all real. They're all real. It can be a Goliath of persistent worry. Worry can be a giant. It could be a Goliath of fear. It can be a situation, a circumstance, a problem, a pressure. It could be a task that looms large, even larger than life. In our text, Goliath was a physical giant. But the giants that we face are not merely physical, but also psychological and emotional. But just like Goliath in our text, they're all very real. They're all very, very real. Goliath in our text was intimidating. Morning and evening, 40 days, day after day, there was this constant, relentless pressure and harassment, a tyrannizing force. When that is the case, you have a giant in your life. Goliath reminded Israel every morning, loud and clear, I'm here. He reminded them every morning, I'm here. Don't forget, I'm still here. When that happens, whatever it is, you've got a giant in your life. They awoke in the morning. They went to bed in the evening, being reminded, I'm here. Being reminded Goliath was still there. Around the clock, Goliath was on their mind. They could not escape. They could pretend he wasn't there, but they knew better. Goliath was on their mind. And they began their days with Goliath. And they ended their days with Goliath. And the next day, the same thing. They couldn't get away. No doubt this would be a very draining and exhausting situation. We've all been there at some point. It'll drain the life out of you, where you have nothing left. Goliath affected everything in their lives, and he would not go away. I'm sure that every morning the Israelites hoped that Goliath wasn't there. But every morning, there he was. And he reminded them loud and clear, I'm still here. He presented himself. He set forth himself 40 days. And I believe day by day, he got bigger in their eyes. He just got bigger and bigger. And there he is every day. And the feeling of helplessness and hopelessness is growing by the day. And they're being controlled by his presence. They're being controlled by it. And they're being controlled more and more each day. Morning and evening, he presented himself. He consumed their days. He was defining their lives. Goliath's presence was setting the pattern of their lives. And Goliath's presence was disabling Israel from functioning normally. When these things happen, and they do, you have a giant in your life. Goliath would step forward, and Israel would flee. And when it, whatever it is moving forward and you're going backward, you have a giant in your life. Goliath, day by day, was prevailing. You can shut your door, go to bed, put the covers over your head, but guess what? I'm still here! Still there. Doesn't go away. Goliath stood in the way. Stood in the way of them living a normal life. When it stands between you and God, between you advancing spiritually, between you and enjoyment of God, you have a giant in your life. Again, these Goliaths can come in many forms. And we create our own Goliaths. Most people who have Goliaths in their lives are self-created Goliaths. But they're still real. Again, they can come in the form of trouble. Trouble of any kind. It can come in the form of a burden. He can be an obstacle. He can be an irritant. He can be a threat. He could be a person. It could be an issue. And once again, people take an issue that big and make it 9.5 feet tall. It can be a hurt feelings. It can be a habit. It can be a failure, a distraction of any kind. It can be a doubt. It can be a sin. And we could go on and on. Goliaths come in many forms. But notice Goliath's positioning. In verse 4, there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. There went out. That's his position. He went out. They're on the cliff. But then notice verse 25. Verse 25. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man that is come up? He's coming up. So that tells me he's gone down the cliff that the Philistines were on. And he has come into the valley. He's coming up. He's approaching. He's moving into our territory. These giants, they don't stand still. They just keep on progressing. Making inroads into your brain. Making inroads into your home. Or whatever. You cannot allow whatever the giant is, you cannot allow it to make advance in your life. But that's what's happening here. 40 days, and Goliath is advancing. He's advancing. He's spreading his territory. So let's look at our attitude toward and our perception of the giant. In verses 12 through 18, we are told how it came to pass for David to be there. He was sent on what many would consider a menial task. Son, bring some lunch to your brothers and see how they're doing. And then you come home. David was eager. He was faithful in this, and he was willing to minister to others. So David is serving in the menial, faithful in the small things. And that would put him in a position for something great. So many people and so many pastors make the mistake. You get yourself in a position to do the extraordinary by being faithful in the ordinary. And you do not give somebody who is unfaithful in the small things something big. How foolish is that? Yet it happens all the time. Happens all the time. Brother so-and-so is unfaithful in his attendance, so what we're going to do is give him a job where he'll be here. Well, that's foolish. That's nonsense. It's insanity. It doesn't make sense. You put yourself in a position to do great things by being faithful in the small. And that's a whole nother message. But that's what we see here. And in verse 23, we read, as he talked with his brethren, here comes Goliath, bellowing out his challenge, just as he had done for 40 days and 40 nights. And David saw him, and David heard the taunts of Goliath. Notice verse 23. Verse 23. David came and saluted his brethren, and then in verse 23, last part of verse 23, and David heard them. That is the taunts of Goliath. He also heard and saw the reaction of the army of Israel. Verse 24 and 25, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were sore afraid. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man that has come up? So in our text, there is a contrast between the perception of the Israelites of Goliath and the perception that David had of Goliath. And we also see a contrast in attitude and reaction between Israel and David toward Goliath. The Israelites saw a 9.5 to 10 foot tall giant with over 200 pounds of armor. What they saw was real. We must realize that. In their eyes, they see an insurmountable obstacle. In their eyes, they see an impossibility. Now, their perception of Goliath being 9.5 to 10 feet tall, with over 200 pounds of armor, that's real, that's accurate. But when they saw him as insurmountable, an impossibility, that's inaccurate. And Israel was horrified. They become very unsettled and disturbed. They're alarmed, they're distressed, they're terrified at the presence of Goliath. And they no doubt are reasoning amongst themselves, trying to figure out, how are we going to appease Goliath? We know this because Saul had an incentive plan. We see that in verse 25. Who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. Well, that's quite an incentive plan. So they're trying to figure out, what are we going to do with this giant? They judged after the sight of their eyes. And that was their mistake. They judged by what they heard with their ears. They looked only on the outward. And their hearts failed them. If all you see is what you see, physically, you do not see all that can be seen. In other words, if all you're looking at is the physical, and do not see the spiritual, which is far greater than the physical, your reality is skewed. Yes, it was reality. There's Goliath. That's reality. But that's all they saw. So their reality is greatly skewed. And if your reality is skewed, your judgment is skewed, and your reaction is skewed, there's nothing good that can come from it. In verse 32, David speaks to Saul. In verse 33, Saul tries to dissuade David by means of human reasoning. And David's response, you see, in verses 34 through verse 37. And basically, we got to save time here. Basically, his response is, God will. God spared me from a bear. God spared me from a lion. God enabled me. God will. God will. God will. How do I know that? Because He already has done it in the past. And I haven't forgotten it. And I know God will. God will give me victory over Goliath. David had faith in God. He believes. He knows the Lord. He will. David is embracing the faithfulness, the ability, the love of God. He is saying the Lord has in my life, and I know that He will. And David is energized by this. And this caused David to see Goliath differently than the Israelites saw him. David saw Goliath not so much as a 9.5 to 10-foot giant with over 200 pounds of armor, but he saw him as a Philistine, an uncircumcised Philistine. That's mentioned in verse 26, verse 36, and verse 37. While Israel was looking at the massiveness and the intimidating presence of Goliath and hearing the booming challenges of Goliath, David sees him as uncircumcised, which simply means he did not belong to God. He's an enemy of God. He looked at this giant through spiritual eyes. And he said, I see somebody that doesn't belong to God. He's uncircumcised. He doesn't have God's help. I have God's help. He doesn't. He sees him in the light of God. He's basically saying, the only giant in my life is God. What other so-called giants there may be, God's bigger. The only giant in my life is God. Oh, for that to be true. Goliath was a menacing figure, but David sees him through the lens of a living God. A living God. And Goliath wasn't so big. In verses 38 and 39, Saul arms David with his armor. And David's response was, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. I've proved God. I know what God will do. I don't know what this armor will do. Notice verse 39, and David put them off, knowing the Lord, He will. He will. David steps into the valley, knowing that God is greater than Goliath. And that is how you and I are to step into the valley, knowing that God is greater. Whatever the time, whatever the place, whatever the problem, whatever the trial, whatever the difficulty, whatever the need, God is greater. Whatever the so-called impossibility, God is greater. Whatever the infirmity, whatever the condition, God is greater. When David stepped in that valley to face Goliath, he did not trust in his own strength. He did not trust in his own ability. He did not trust in his own planning. He knew that God would direct the stone. He knew that God would handle it all. And he went forth with great courage, trusting God. And again, there are giants that rise up in our lives. Go with God. Embracing His faithfulness, His ability, His love. You cannot lose. you will prevail over the giants. We cannot allow any giant, whatever form it takes, to make advances in our life. We can't allow that. Can't allow it in the church. They cannot be allowed to prevail. And we must not create our own giants. Don't do that. There's enough giants out there that you have to face. You don't need to go creating your own. But people do it all the time. We all do. There are and will be battles and struggles and seemingly impossible situations. You look back in your life and look at the giants that you have faced. And oh, how good God has been. Step out with God. There may be a giant in the morning. I'm here. You step out with God. Just step out with God. And you will prevail over the giants. Brother Ben, if you'll come and lead us in verse of song.